Hello and welcome to another video. This is Grimdark Paint by Miniature Studio. My name's Axel and I hope you enjoy this video on how to oil wash a miniature. Now, there are lots of different ways you can use oil paints in miniature painting. One of the most frequent and simplest form is to create a nice oil wash with the oil paints. You can then apply this all over a miniature and then dab it off, or you can apply it as a pin wash in specific parts and areas. Now, you're going to need a few tools to oil wash a miniature and to create an oil wash. On screen right now you can see that I've just been going through some of the different mineral spirits that are available on the market. You'll need mineral spirits to thin the oil paint and to make the wash itself. And then you'll need a form of oil paint. In this case, I'm using the range by Abteilung. I'm using the Abteilung 502 oil paint. They're a really cool and awesome type of oil paint. They're designed specifically for miniature painting, which is really, really cool. So there are some great colors in the range. I'm also using their thinners, and you saw that I've got a couple of different thinners there. You'll need some glass jars or metal jars to put your oil paint into. And then you'll need some cotton swabs, makeup sponges, just to dab and remove the excess of mineral spirits off your miniature, as well as a paintbrush to mix your mineral spirits and oil paints. Again, I'm using a synthetic brush by Ammo, and synthetic brushes are generally preferred for this sort of thing because your sable brushes can deteriorate quite quickly with the mineral spirits. I'm also using a piece of cardboard to place the oil paints onto. That way the oil will absorb into the cardboard and help reduce the drying time of the oil paints. You would have noticed the three different types of mineral spirits that I showed on screen there. I had an odorless thinner, a fast dry thinner, and a matte effect thinner. For this video, I'm choosing to use the fast dry thinner. That way, again, it helps speed up the drying time and the drying process. To get my miniature ready for the oil paint wash or the oil wash stage, all I did was I blacked out all of the parts of the armor, like the tubing between armor panels, the gun, and anything else I wanted black or painted a different color at a later stage. I also applied the decal, the Imperial Fist transfer, on his right shoulder pad. And I did that using some microsol and microset after gloss varnishing that right shoulder pad to make it a bit easier. Right, so here we go, we're starting to create the oil wash. And like I said, I'm applying a little dollop of oil paint onto the cardboard. Again, the reason for using cardboard as the palette here to put your oil paint onto is because oil paints consist of pigment and a type of oil to suspend the pigment in, unlike an acrylic paint which uses an acrylic medium to suspend the pigment in. And it's because of that oil that oil paints take such a long time to dry, but also give you the advantages of being able to create wet on wet smooth blending. By using cardboard here, that cardboard soaks up a little bit of the oil, not all of it, but a little bit, just to start assisting in drying time. And I think that's the first time I used that black tube, so you can see there was quite a bit of oil at the top of the tube, so I put that on the cardboard first and then squidged out the oil paint a little bit higher up, just to make sure that there wasn't excess oil there. Now for this demo, I'm using a glass jar, and the glass jar is, well, not a glass jar, it's a glass well. I got that from IKEA. It's a candle holder actually. And I'm using a pipette. I've got a bag of like 100 pipettes to take some of that fast dry Abteilung thinner and drop a few drops of it into the glass well. That's what I'm going to use to create my wash in. So you can see I'm using the pipette there, and I'm just dropping, well, a couple of drops into the well. Because I'm going to be going for an overall oil wash, which I'm going to then wipe off any excess that I don't want on the miniature, I'm going to make the oil wash quite thin. It's a good idea to keep in mind that the thicker your oil wash, the longer it's going to take to dry on the miniature. The thinner, the less time it's going to take to dry, but the more applications you're going to need to get good coverage. Now, the reasons for using an oil wash can be many. It can be to do some weathering, it can be to filter the model and add glazes of color, it can be used as a panel liner to separate different parts of the miniature and make them pop and stand out from each other a bit more. I'm kind of using it as an overall filter to give my miniature a bit of a grim, dark, grimy feel of having dirt and some weathering on him. And I'm also using it to accentuate the different parts of the armor by separating them when the dark oil color flows into the crevices and the cracks. To create my oil wash, I don't want to just use a black oil wash, so I've got the 3 colors that you saw at the start laid out on the palette there. One is black, one is Starship Filth, which is like a greeny, grey, grimy type of color, and the last one is Burnt Umber. And I'm using virtually equal parts of each to make a mix that I'm going to use on the miniature. And you can see the consistency in the glass jar there. I'm just going to take my brush, load it up, and I'm going to start to dab it into all of the recesses that I want covered. And after that, just go over the entire miniature with a nice thin glaze of wash. I don't need to drown the miniature in it. I just need to cover all the parts I need to, but not put so much on that it's starting to overflow on the base. And you'll see how quickly it just sinks into those recesses and starts to add a nice amount of separation to all the cracks and crevices. And remember, the nice thing about using an oil wash as opposed to acrylic wash is that if you use white spirit, you can always reactivate it and start to remove it. So it's very forgiving in terms of making any mistakes in case you put it somewhere that you don't want it to be, or you put too much in a specific area. You can always remove it later on. You'll also notice that I'm using a good amount of it on his right shoulder pad, and that's because when I applied my decal, I didn't quite get it centered, and I didn't realize that it wasn't quite centered until after it had fully dried into place. So to kind of course correct for that, I painted a little bit of a shadow on the bottom rear side of the shoulder, which kind of gives a negative fill, so to speak. So when you look at the miniature, the decal looks more centered. It's just like a bit of an optical illusion. And you'll see a bit later on that I actually use some of the brown oil paint to further accentuate that shadow. Right, so that's a nice overall spread of oil wash on the miniature, and you can see how it's really filled in all the gaps and all the crevices and the cracks and the panel lines on the miniature to give it a bit more definition. It's so much easier to do this than it is to go around by hand and trying to paint into each of those tiny little lines. Just doing the black lining on this to black out the rubberized armor joint things that are between his panels of armor, that was a pain, to be honest. I don't enjoy that stage of the painting. But this stage is nice and relaxing. You can just keep adding more and more, removing some, add more, remove some. You'll see I've also got that my trusty piece of kitchen towel at the bottom, and I'm just dabbing any excess oil paint wash off my brush to dry it out a bit onto that kitchen towel. Now that I've done my generic oil wash, you can see I took a little bit of the brown oil paint and I'm just dabbing little dots of it onto the armor. What I'm doing here is I want the lower half of the model to be a little bit more weathered, with a little bit more dirt, which is brown. So I put those little dots on the miniature. I use my oil wash to clean the brush, and I soak out the excess of the mineral spirits onto the kitchen towel. And then I just use the tip of the brush to start streaking those little dots to blend them out and just filter a nice colour like dirt and grime over the bottom part of the miniature. Once I've done this, I'm going to pick up one of those Q-tips, well, cotton buds, and also one of the makeup sponges. I think I start with a makeup sponge. And then I'll use that to start dabbing off the excess of the oil wash so that it all dries a bit faster. Yeah, there's the makeup sponge. And I use that to dab off and remove the excess of the mineral spirits. But I also use it to blend any harsh transitions or stains of oil wash on the miniature. So I'm having a look at it, I'm seeing if there are any harsh lines that have been left over, and then just with that dry makeup sponge, you just dab and remove stuff until you're happy with the blend and the amount of oil paint that's left on your miniature. So it leaves all the recesses dark and all that lovely separation of panels and lines. But those flatter panels that you want to have better blending on, you just keep dabbing, keep going back and forth until you're happy with the results. It really doesn't have to be a long process. It's you can put in as much time or as little time as you want when you use oil paints and oil washes. It really comes down to how much you want to invest in the project or the miniature that you're painting. If this is going to be a batch painted set of miniatures for an army, you really don't want to spend lots of time on this. You just want to use it as that quick, fast tool to add definition and to separate panels and joints and lines. Now, something that you'll see me do in a little bit, which you shouldn't, I don't really recommend that you do, I did it to speed things up a bit, is I use a hairdryer to dry off the mineral spirits on the miniature. Now, safety precautions first. Throughout this entire video, I am wearing a full face respirator. It's by 3M, and it filters out organic gases and vapors. This protects me from the fumes of the mineral spirits, because I'm doing this in a closed room. Even though I had the window open, mineral spirits are still harmful. You shouldn't inhale them. Even odorless ones, they still have fumes, you just can't smell them. So it's really important that you, when dealing with oil paints, you make sure, especially if you're using mineral spirits of any kind, that you're taking precautions and you're wearing goggles to cover your eyes in case anything splashes, and you're using an organic gas and vapor filter to protect your lungs. So that said, that's the disclaimer. Make sure you're safe when you do this sort of thing. In this instance, like I said, I'm using a full face respirator mask, so it covers my mouth, it covers my eyes, it covers my entire front of my face. They're great investment. So what I was going to say is I used a hairdryer to help speed up the drying of the mineral spirits, and I can do this safely because I was wearing that respirator. But something that a lot of people don't know is that they think that heat is going to dry oil paints faster, whereas oil paints actually dry through oxidation. Oxidation? I think that's the word. It's the reaction between the oil paints and oxygen in the air that speeds up oil paints drying. So the fastest way for you to get oil paints to dry, even if you use a quick dry thinner, is to make sure that the miniature is coming into contact with lots of fresh, freely moving air. That's why a lot of oil painters' studios will be very well ventilated and have lots of fast moving air coming through it, because A, for safety reasons because of those mineral spirits, but B, also it helps increase the drying time of oil paints. With mine now that the miniature's been done, not entirely, but now that this oil wash stage has been done, I've actually sat it outside on my windowsill so it can dry a little bit faster. You can see that I'm now continuing just to go round the miniature and dab, using dabbing motions, little taps and smudges of the makeup sponge, to filter and fade those transitions of oil paint on the miniature and to remove it where I don't want it. And that's left me with a nice looking weathered and washed miniature, which I can go back to and paint all the other details in as and when I want to. Now, because I'm going to go back at a later stage and continue to use acrylic paints on this miniature, as long as the oil paints are completely dry, I can technically just paint using acrylic paints directly on top of the oil paints. I know people say that you can't do that. That's actually not true. I've done it lots on my Warhound Titan that I painted, and I've done it on other miniatures as well. You just have to wait for the oil paint to dry, and in some cases use slightly thicker paint so it adheres a little bit better to that oil paint surface. If you want to make life easier though, then what I'd recommend that you do is you spray the miniature with a matte or a satin varnish and just use that as kind of like a saving stage to make sure that you can paint with acrylics on the miniature more easily. Now you can just see what I mentioned earlier now, which is I'm using a bit of that brown oil paint just directly on the bottom half of that shoulder pad to create that illusion and optical effect that the transfer is actually more centered than it really is, by adding a shadow underneath the back part of the shoulder pad. I was really happy how that came out. It kind of fixed the mistake I made with the transfer. I also weathered the transfer a bit. I chipped it a little bit, and that helped create the illusion as well. The only downside to doing what I'm doing here though is because I've used slightly thicker, neater oil paints to create that blend of shadow on the bottom of the shoulder pad, it is going to take a little bit longer to dry. So I might have to wait a couple of days before I go back to this miniature, just to make sure that the shoulder pad is truly dry before I varnish it. Because if you remember, oil paints dry, we said, by coming into contact with oxygen. If you varnish the miniature straight away and the oil paints haven't dried, you're just covering technically wet oil paints with varnish and then not allowing oxygen to get to it, so it's never really truly drying. It will dry eventually, but it might not sit properly, it might reactivate at a later stage and then you'll have issues. Better to, once you've completed this process and this stage, better to let the oil wash completely cure, completely dry, then seal it with a matte varnish or a satin varnish and go back to painting it. You can always have another project on the go that you'd be able to go and paint and do other things with while you're waiting for this to dry. There's no rush, right? Well, hopefully there's no rush. I hope you have no reason to rush these things, but that would be my recommendation. That's kind of really it. You can see that I'm using a Q-tip now. You can get different types of Q-tips, by the way. This is a nice little tip. The one that I've got in my hand at the moment has a round head at one end and then a conical head at the other, which gives you a little bit more precision using just the tip of it. Please, when you use oil washes and you use a reductive technique, so to speak, where you're dabbing the oil paint off the miniature, be very light-handed and careful. So many miniatures that you see painted in this way or having this effect on them when you zoom into the miniature, you can see little bits of cotton bud hair stuck to the mini. You don't want that. That's going to ruin your paint job. You don't need to be aggressive with the cotton buds. You can just gently tap. And if you can use a makeup sponge instead of a cotton bud, that would be preferential because the makeup sponge doesn't leave bits of hairs all over your miniature. You could, of course, just use an acrylic, sorry, not acrylic, a synthetic paintbrush. But there you go. That's it. That's my miniature oil washed. I hope you found this video useful. Thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe for more.